Welcome to episode 10 of the Schoolhouse series. This is on reverb, and the intent of this video is to understand how to create space and depth to our sound. Today's course overview will be going over several different types of reverbs, how to properly blend it, and then some considerations when applying reverb. All right, let's go ahead and go over the different types of reverbs. I have them all loaded up down here, starting from simple to complex, and we're working with this little basic drum loop to showcase them all. All right, now, understand that reverbs are all programmed differently and they all mimic different spaces and rooms. So you're going to get different variations with different reverbs. Obviously, they're not all going to sound the same. And it'll come with experience of understanding what reverb sounds like what and which one you want to use. There's no right way to use. There's a proper way to use reverb, but there's no right reverb to use for every sound. Sometimes you'll be using some reverbs for drum loops and a different reverb for a bass. You never know. A guideline to follow is try to stick with the same reverb for all your tracks because, like I mentioned earlier, they all sound different. And if you have like multiple sounds fed into different reverbs, sometimes those reverbs can clash and it just gets weird. So let's go ahead and get into this. I'm just going to explain the very basic knobs that you need to know that are pertinent to all reverbs. So obviously there's a bunch of parameters here in the stock Ableton one, but some of these parameters aren't in the hybrid reverb, or they might not be in the kilohertz reverb. Like for instance, this one's very basic. Let's actually start with this one because the kilohertz reverb has all of the knobs that you will see in pretty much every reverb. So let's go ahead and turn this on at 100% dry wet and see what it does. Right? And we can adjust the size of not the size, but how long the reverb brings out with this decay. So like at 30 seconds, when we play just this hi-hat, that reverb is gonna ring out for 30 seconds. Or that kick or whatever with the hi-hat. And then no decay, or like very minimal at 500 milliseconds. So let's just adjust. As you can see, that's decay. Now, the dampen just kind of softens how bright or dull the reverb is. So no damp, super bright, full damp. It's like it's got like a cloth over it or something. And then the size is what the size of the actual room is that the sound is being fed into. So a very small room at small size. Let me adjust this decay a little bit. And then full size, very big room. As you can see. And then the width is just how wide the reverb is. So no width is like a mono reverb. Full width. Very wide reverb. Early determines at what time the first reflection comes back to you, and this might sound complex, it's really not that important, but I'll explain it to you, is that imagine a sound playing in a tiled bathroom, like we went over in the stereo image video. So that sound comes out of a speaker, it gets fed through space, and then it will hit those tiled walls and reflect back like a mirror. And that first sound, that first reflection that you come back, you can adjust how fast or late that first reflection comes in, and based on that speed will give you different tonalities for a reverb. So let's just do like really long early reflection, so it'll take longer to come back to us, and let's listen. And then a very fast early reflection. As you can see, the reverb is acting differently that way. I just wanted to explain the technical knowledge as to why, if you're curious, but just know this gives you different tonalities. Most people keep them at the stock setting. They don't really mess with pre-delay. So let's move on. This is stock Ableton reverb at 100% dry wet. And as you can see, we have our size, decay, and stereo knob down here, as well as our dry wet. And there's a bunch of other parameters as well that you can mess with. All this top half is essentially like EQ. So input filter determines what frequencies get fed into the reverb. So if we enable low cut, we're only going to get the high frequencies fed through. And if we do low or high cut, we only get the low frequencies, obviously. And if we enable both, we get a bandpass filter. So let's just deselect both for the full signal. Diffusion I'll go over. So this determines the way that the reverb tail is EQ'd. So let's just take out all the highs here and listen to it for the diffusion part. Let's bring them back and cut out the lows. And then this knob diffuse down here determines like how loud the actual reverb is, like when it's like fading out. As you can see. Now, all of these parameters we went over for this reverb and this one, again, they carry over to all the other ones. So this is Ableton Hybrid, which is essentially combining two reverbs with this blend knob. So at 50-50, you're getting half of both. At 100% or 0 to 100, so if it's all the way to the right, you're getting the reverb of all of these parameters down here. Again, we have our decay and size. All the way to the left only does the convulsion reverb parameters up here. And we have our decay here on this like parameter down here, and then our size as well. And we can blend them with this knob. And then we have our stereo width up here, like so. And then we have our input control on this parameter here on the top, this EQ, so we can determine what frequencies get fed through again. So let's move on. This is the convulsion reverb. I went over this pretty well in the stereo image one. Here we have presets, which we'll actually go over last, but just know that all of the parameters here are the same. The only difference with the convulsion reverb is you can actually determine where the reverb is in space. So like in the very far back of the room. Let's actually make this very small. It's going to get weird. I'm going to adjust this really quickly to a more understandable reverb. Let's put all this back. So it's in the back of the room right now, and then directly in front of us. And then the back left, back right, front left, front right, and then the middle. Right, and then we have our stereo width here on the top right. And then we have our EQ as well, some dampen parameters, and then ways that you get to affect the shape of the reverb, which I think is like part of this as well. Yeah, let's move on. I don't want to get too hung up and sucked into a rabbit hole of all of these. If you are on Mac OS and you have Apple, lucky you, because you have an amazing, amazing reverb that comes for free with Mac. If you go to plugins here on the left part of your browser, the very first folder should be Apple. You click on that, you go to the AU Matrix reverb. It looks like this. And this looks very primal and basic, but it's very powerful. So we have our dry wet up here. As you can see, everything's like labeled here. This is the small large mix. So if you remember the hybrid reverb, we can blend between the small reverb and the large reverb. So far right is the only, you're only using the large reverb. Far left, you're only using the small. So let me collapse these. Let's just mess around with the small reverb. This is the size, the pre-delay range. As you can see, you're getting very different tonalities and variations out of this one opposed to the other ones. You can get similar effects with these if you start adjusting the same parameters, but because this one is built by Apple, it sounds differently and is, I don't know, it's weird, but it's really cool. And then a very complex one being a third-party one. This is called Superplate by Sound Toys. Their whole pack, I think, for like all their effects is like $500. It's super pricey, but you get what you pay for. Like this has an insane amount of presets, and the way that this is programmed to fit analog reverbs and then the different types of analogs for that variation that you get. If you click the tweak knob, you get your EQ down here and a bunch of other parameters to mess with like the reverb and stuff like that. We have our decay, obviously the same as all reverbs. That pre-delay. I don't know if you can adjust the size and shape here. I guess you can't, but you can adjust the stereo width. But yeah, those are all the different types of reverbs. Now, I will go over the presets like I was mentioning earlier. So if you're having a hard time understanding how to use your reverb, all you have to do is just go to Reverb in the browser, click the down arrow, and it opens up 3 folders, Hall, Room, and Special. If you open up those, these are presets for all the hall reverbs, obviously all the presets for room reverb. So like this is supposed to mimic a garage if we listen. As you can see, this one is a living room. So you can experiment with these presets. All right, let's go into how to blend reverbs. We're going to start with very simple methods to a little bit more complex. I'm going to go ahead and choose a preset from Ableton. Let's do the garage one. Actually, no, drums room, because we're playing with a drum loop. All right, let's listen to this. It's at 100% dry wet. Let's put it down to completely dry. And the first method is literally just blending it in with the dry wet knob. So as we play, we're just going to slowly raise this, like pretty much with that break and back off technique, until we find a sweet spot for our reverb. Okay, 20% dry wet. You can still hear the original drum loop pretty much dry. And because it's 20% wet, we get a little bit of reverb sitting in the background. I do not enjoy this method just because all of the frequencies are being fed into the reverb, and it just kind of like muddies up the whole thing over time when this gets more complex. So to polish this up, what we'll do is we'll duplicate that. I'm gonna turn that first one off. Here's the duplicate. What we're gonna do is create an audio effect rack like we have in the previous videos. So do Command G to group it. Click this bottom icon to open up chains. Right click in the gray box area down here to create new chain. This new chain on the bottom is called dry because there's nothing on it. And then this top one is called wet. And we're going to solo this wet chain, and we'll put it on 100% reverb. And let's listen. Cool, we have our reverb layer. Now, what I'm going to do is throw an EQ8 after that reverb, and I'm going to low cut all of that kick and snare out. So we're just getting the reverb on our cymbals and stuff. Maybe a little bit of the snare too. Or whatever, that is a clap, not a snare, sorry. So now if we unsolo this, we have a 100% reverb layer paired with our dry layer. And the reverb's a little loud, so to mix this in, what you do is cut the volume all the way out on that wet layer, and as you play, slowly bring up the volume of that wet layer until you get a nice, well, reverb layer. Okay, not bad. So let's just type it in, -6 decibels for a whole number. And I adjusted the decay a little bit. And as you can see, this sounds a lot better than this. And it sounds better because we've soloed the reverb on one layer and we cut out all the lows so it's not clashing and getting super crazy. So definitely my preferred method is to go with audio effect racks on your reverb. That way, this one's at 100% and you can adjust all the parameters, and you know that like your reverb layer is completely separate than your dry, and you're just mixing it in with the volume on the chains here. The next method is with a return track. So above your main channel in this dark gray area part of like the right side of Ableton, if we right click, insert return track, it created a return track. I'm gonna go ahead and make it black because I hate that color. Now, what I can do is let's take that same reverb that we were playing with and paste it down here. We'll turn it on and we'll put the dry wet at 100%, right? And we'll go back, we'll leave that. So this is the return track with the reverb at 100%. We'll go back to the original drum loop and we'll play it. It's dry, but if we want to mix it into this return track, we're actually going to use this little rectangle here. Right now it says -infinity because no volume from this track is being fed into that return track. If I click and drag this up as I play, you'll see how it starts to feed into this reverb on the return track. As you can see. So if we go ahead and just type in a value like -12 and we listen. And yeah, that's that. And why do we use return tracks is because it's a way of saving CPU usage. So if I had multiple tracks down here, and let's just say, I don't know, I'm just gonna start throwing on random stuff. Let me get like a vocal. Ride this wave, and then I don't know, like an ambiance. These are all just very stupid samples, but the reason that we have return tracks is that you can have one reverb here and you can feed in as many audio tracks as you want. So like that vocal I can mix in by just throwing in some reverb to the return track, as well as this, and they're all being fed in. So the drum loop is being fed, the vocal, and then this ambiance. Right, but it's only one reverb, so this is just a way to save CPU usage. I don't really mess with return tracks anymore because I've learned that the reverb is a lot harder to tame in a return track. For instance, I don't know really how I want to explain this. I don't want to like get too complicated, but like if I fed this ambiance here into the return track at 100%, let me duplicate this real quick and freeze and flatten. I hope I'm not losing your train of thought. Yeah, okay, yeah, this is a good example. So let's listen to this, right? We know that there's a tail end of reverb here. We hear it fading out. Let me make it more exaggerated by extending the decay. So you hear this entire thing right here has that tail end of reverb, but if I duplicate that same track and I freeze and flatten it, the reverb's not there. It doesn't show us that there's reverb there, right? But we still know it's blending in here, and that's an issue because we can't always visualize where our reverb is at. So let me do another example. Let me go ahead, copy this reverb. This will definitely sum it up for you really well. Freeze and flatten this. Bam, there you go. So when the reverb is on the original track and you were to freeze and flatten it, you can see that this reverb is fading out here for this bar, where if it gets fed into the return track, you won't see it. Which is an issue because it gets way harder to tame your mixing and stuff when you have a reverb on a return track and a bunch of stuff is being fed into it, because sometimes all of this stuff that comes afterwards is just being fed into parts of your song where you don't want. Sometimes you want the reverb to cut abruptly, or sometimes you don't. So that's why I haven't really been messing with return tracks. Just remember that the 3 ways to mix them in is with that dry wet knob at the bottom, just slowly blending it in as you listen. My preferred way being the audio effect rack, where you have a dry and a wet chain. That wet chain's got 100% reverb. That way you can just really manage it really well. And then that third option being the return track, where you're feeding any single track you want into that reverb with this little rectangle guy volume parameter on that designated track. All right, let's go over some reverb considerations. The first being that they are quite CPU heavy. Any audio effect that delays a sound and stretches it out, like a delay, an echo, a reverb, anything like that is all very CPU heavy, because the computer has to process the sound being fed into that effect, and then it has to generate all of the tail end and the delays and the echoes of that sound, which is just, it's hard for the computer to do, especially if you don't have a good computer. So the workflow around that is to find a reverb that you like, and then group all of the sounds you want on that reverb, and then pasting that reverb on the group, right? So there's only one reverb on the group, but all of the sounds in that group are being fed through it. We kind of went over that for the return track. I'm just not going to get into return tracks right now. We'll get into way more in-depth techniques and tips and tricks on that in the Fleet series, which is after the Schoolhouse, but let's go back to considerations. So yeah, they're all CPU heavy. And if we go back to the different types of reverbs, these are pretty much in order from less CPU heavy to max. So like the kilohertz reverb is very minimal CPU usage because there's just not many parameters, right? There's not a lot for the computer to read and to process. But if we were to go all the way up to like a Convulsion Reverb Pro, this is very CPU heavy because there's just so much that the computer has to process for that sound to work in this effect, right? So that's that. The next thing is that usually you want reverb to come at the very end of your post-processing, or the end of all of your effects. And here's a really good example as to why. So like I have a reverb here. Oh, not anymore, actually. Let me go grab it. This reverb is on this drum loop here, and it has this decay, and we'll put it 100% dry wet, so it sounds like this. See how it's ringing out right here? And I freeze and flatten that, and you can see it down here. It's very faint, so let's just go ahead and turn this up, see it more. You see that tail end? This is the tail end of the reverb, right? Now let's say I had that reverb at the very beginning of my post-processing chain, and I decide I want to distort the sound. So I'm gonna go ahead and put an overdrive on it. Let's even do an OTT, and I'm just gonna quickly adjust these parameters to show you what happens when that reverb comes before. Let's play this part. Turn this up. Okay, let's duplicate this and freeze and flatten to show what happened. Boom, there you go. Okay, so this is the reverb with no effects on it, right? This is the tail end. You can barely see it, but you can hear it ever so slightly. But then when you put post-processing on, it blows up into all of this, which becomes an issue because like all of this very faint stuff you can't really see. It will definitely start to ring through the more effects you put after a reverb. So that's why I say usually put it at the end of your post-processing. That's not to say you can put it at the beginning if you're trying to immediately create space and depth to a sound. Just be aware that the more processing you put after, that very delicate signal will kind of get out of control. So I guess the guideline is if reverb is at the beginning of your post-processing, make it very small and tight because the more effects layered on top will start to expand that reverb. Whereas if you just had a very big reverb in the beginning and you layer sounds, it's going to blow up like out of control. So yeah, those are my reverb considerations. I don't think I have any more. Oh yes, I do. I have one more. And that is usually you don't want to feed low end into a reverb. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. We have that bass loop from before right here. And I'm just gonna cut out or just solo the sub with this EQ. And let's duplicate this, freeze and flatten that. And let's put an EQ on here to see what that signal is that we just flattened. All right, so this is the sub soloed with reverb on it. And if we play, you see that? This is low end that has width to it. Like if we were to swap between mid side signal and look at the side information, this is all low end side information from the reverb. And you don't want that layered on top of your original sub because this signal will screw up the original sub. It won't make it as powerful. Sometimes it'll make it muddy and out of control. It's just bad. That's not saying you can't do it. Like you can totally do it if you want. But if you want cleaner music, the consideration is that when you apply a reverb to a song or a sound is that you should be low cutting the information at least after. You can do it before and after, but I would definitely just suggest after. So we're not reverbing the sub, right? That low end information is not getting reverbed. And if you want to bring your original sound back, you just create that dry chain underneath that wet that we made so that all are back to normal. And if we were to duplicate this and freeze and flatten, okay, now let's throw an EQ onto here and let's just solo out the sub again and listen. We shouldn't have any mid-side signal. As you can see, there is a little bit of information here. That's just like background rumble and stuff. It's not from the sub. It might be a little bit from the sub. It could be from this signal up here, but the actual original sub peak being here is not being fed. And that's like when we're on the mid signal, you can see that this is all the mono signal, right? But the side, that big hump isn't there. We just have a little bit, and that's just probably very, very low frequencies, like below the EQ spectrum all the way down here that are being brought up from the post-processing and the reverb. That's just inevitable. But yeah, just remember, you don't really want to be reverbing low end because it will get blown up and out of control. All right, fantastic. We got lesson 10 out of the way on the Schoolhouse series. I think we're actually almost done with the Schoolhouse. And today was everything on reverbs. We went over different types of reverbs. We showcased them all with that drum loop, all made by different people. Just know that The more minimal reverb is, the less CPU heavy it will be. And then obviously the more complex, the more CPU heavy. And then the workflow around CPU usage is to prevent lag and stuff is to use as minimal reverbs as possible. So throwing them onto groups or return tracks is the way to go. And then the considerations being, try to keep reverb at the last thing that you do, so you're not adding post-processing on top and having it get out of control. Don't reverb your low end, because that low end, once it's fed into the reverb, it gets super wide and it rumbles like out of control. It just creates muddiness. And what else was there? Oh yeah, just I guess recap on like my preferred method is creating an audio effect rack, having that wet chain have 100% like reverb on it, and then you're just low cutting everything after that reverb. So you're only reverbing like your mids and highs, and then you just mix it in through volume. The next video, we're gonna get into song structure and how to just bookmark parts of your template so that you know just where to fill in the empty spaces. So thank you for watching. I'll catch you over in the next video.